In this video, I'm going to share with you how you can realistically achieve more in a single week than most people do in a single year. This is actually part 2 of a video about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I published the first version of this video, which you can see the link right up here somewhere on this page. That video has been viewed over 130,000 times. And there's a lot of core principles in that. I'm going to highlight some of those, but I'm going to go even deeper in this video about how you can literally approach time in a different way. There are a lot of different ways of looking at time. From a psychological standpoint, time is not linear and it's not chronological. It's not every minute is equal to another minute. For me, 1 minute could be worth 1,000 years. You can experience a peak experience that you grow more or learn more or achieve more or experience more. It's kind of like the idea that you put your hand on a hot stove and that might not feel like 5 seconds. It might feel like an hour. And so time from a psychological standpoint is nonlinear. It's nonlinear also because you can actually go back into the past. You can rethink things. You can reframe things. You can also spend a lot of time. And in fact, human beings do spend probably around a third of their time thinking about operating and imagining and predicting the future. So as humans, psychologically, we're always in the past, present, and future all at once. And we're always skipping around and we're also adjusting our views of the future, adjusting our views of the past. But also from a philosophical standpoint, the Greeks had 2 views of time. One was Kronos time, which is kind of the more traditional view of time, which is chronological time. The past is behind us, which we can't experience. The future is ahead of us. And it's just marching on. Whereas they had another view of time, which is called Kairos time. And Kairos time is more of a qualitative, not a quantitative view of time. And this qualitative view of time views every minute as different, every day as different. And it focuses on opportune times, transformational times, peak experiences. And so if you begin to view your time qualitatively, you can start to realize that you can actually certainly live and achieve more and experience more in a week than maybe your past self did in a full year, when your past self maybe was operating more in a Chronos time, where your past self was maybe on a hamster wheel, just going through the motions. Whereas if you were a lot more honest with yourself, a lot more honest with your past, if you were willing to face the past, if you're willing to learn from your experiences, if you're willing to operate from an approach mindset rather than an avoidance mindset. And research does show that around 80% of people subconsciously operate out of fear. So they're avoiding loss, avoiding risk. Also, as human beings, we have a deep need to be viewed as consistent. And so people will spend way more of their time trying to save face and be perceived as consistent with their past self so that they don't rock the boat, so that they don't have to create awkward situations. And so that leads them to being essentially on a hamster wheel and not visualizing a bigger future self, not being honest about what they want, not being honest about the things that are holding them back. There's a great quote, all progress starts by telling the truth. So if you can visualize a bigger future, if you can be extremely honest with yourself and begin to actually learn from your experiences, all progress starts by telling the truth, but also very honest about your future self. And then if you can start operating from an approach mindset and this is also a growth mindset, where you're no longer worried about failure. People with a growth mindset actually embrace failure because they know that they can turn every experience to their benefit, to their gain. They can turn every experience into learning. And as Seth Godin said, if I fail more than you, I win. Because people with an extreme growth mindset take all experiences and quickly convert them to learning and better strategy, adapting. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through multiple principles. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you a lot of it has to do with your vision and your identity. As people, we're operating based on the vision we most see for our future. This is called prospection and teleology, that just as people, our identity is based on the future we're most committed to, our hope and our strategy. But also, if you're regularly giving yourself space and time to think, and if you're getting yourself committed to a bigger and better future, and again, you're giving yourself truly space to reflect, to evaluate, and to think, you're going to start getting ideas, really powerful ideas. These could be subconscious breakthroughs. They could be inspiration from God, but you're going to get really amazing ideas that if you act upon with boldness, not all of them are going to work. There's a great book actually called Go for No, which is that you're going to go for no. You're proactive. You're willing to fail. You're willing to try. You're beginning with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey would say, and you're striving for things and you're stretching for things way bigger than anything you've ever done before. And you're comfortable with no's. You're not attached to any outcome along the way, but you are also stretching and operating with more of a faith and courage and commitment approach. You're going to open up doors. You're going to be operating very differently. And there's a great book on the subject called As a Man Thinketh, that, as he said in that book, James Allen, he said, we do not attract what we want, but what we are. So as you get committed to a bigger future and as you begin operating with a different identity and as you begin approaching things rather than avoiding, and you become more of a growth mindset where you're no longer worried about failures along the way, and you know that you can convert every experience into learning and again, also you're no longer competing with anyone else. You're playing your own game. You're playing the infinite game, as James Carse would say in the book Finite and Infinite Games. You're no longer competing with other people. You're actually always expanding the vision, expanding the game, and changing the rules of the game. And you're always outgrowing your past self. With that said, let me go ahead and jump into my screen. I'm going to share with you several powerful principles that if you apply, you can definitely start achieving more on a weekly basis than obviously most people do on a yearly basis. But more importantly than that, because it really doesn't matter about you versus anyone else, what matters more is that as you begin to evaluate your past and as you begin to evaluate your time and you realize that you're not the same person you used to be, you now know things your former self didn't know. You're now operating at a higher place with bigger vision, better ability to commit, better models, maybe better people around you to strategize with and mastermind with. You can see that in a week, you can be, realize, and do and achieve things that your past self could have never done in a year or even a decade. And so the goal then becomes that you're referencing against your past self and that your past self's time in terms of qualitative time, in terms of relative time, from an Einstein perspective, relative time, that you can progress, achieve, experience, and expand as much in a week that your past self could in a year or 5 years or in a decade. And there's a great quote, actually, I believe it's from Jean Rousseau. He says that the person who has lived the most is not the person who has had the most years, but the person who has had the most powerful experiences. And so if you approach every week like it's a year, and that you can have soul expanding experiences, which include being honest with your past self, genuinely evaluating and pulling gold from the gold mine of your past, but also making courage moves, having peak experiences, deeply connecting, actually striving for the things that you value, and seeing what forms of miracles or nonlinear forms of growth you can create. Then the weeks become really beautiful. No week will look the same. If you're operating mostly subconsciously, which is how most people are, their weeks look very repetitive. They're basically on a hamster wheel. They're just going through the motions. They're not expanding very much. They're not learning very much. They're not altering their views of themselves, their future, and they're not taking leaps that then expand their identity. So if your weeks look very similar week to week to week, then what that means is you're not learning from your experience very much. You're not evaluating your experience very much. You're not being very honest with yourself. You're also not giving yourself space to stretch your vision, your mindset, and you're not utilizing planning as a concept. Planning is one of the most powerful, inspiring, godly abilities we have as human beings, that we can actually plan. Stephen Covey actually said mental creation precedes physical creation. And so planning, you can't build a house without having a blueprint. You can't build a company without building some form of plan. And yes, the plan will change. But if you're not taking time to plan, to map, to visualize, and then to execute big on the plan, and to build a powerful foundation, but then to take big risks and big courage and opportunities, then your weeks are wasted. But if you spend some time, even just 30 minutes at the end of your week, reflecting, reviewing, being really honest, and then making really bold, powerful plans and seeing how much you can progress and grow, that's different from how much you can do. Progress is not the same as effort. Not all progress is created the same. Not all progress is created equal. And so if you have a bigger vision, if you're operating with greater faith, courage, commitment, and you're willing to try new things, but also if you clear the space, you remove 80% of the things that don't matter. According to the 80-20 principle, 20% of the things in your life are creating almost all of your results, whereas 80% of the things in your life are essentially a distraction. So as you weed out and uncommit to more and more things that are no longer at the standard of your future self, and as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into flow on your 10x future self, then pretty much anything becomes possible, because then you're operating from the future, not the past. And if you're operating from the future, then your future self will give you nonlinear opportunities, pathways, insights, that you could have never had any other way. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm just going to walk you through a set of principles. I invite you to pull out your journal simply to begin living better, more qualitative weeks, where each week looks radically different, radically more powerful than the week before. If you're living qualitatively rather than quantitatively, if you're in Kairos time rather than Kronos time, and if you're operating from relative time rather than basically Newton time, then each week will look qualitatively different. And each week will be highly expansive and filled with many peak experiences, which will alter and transform yourself and your life. And you'll be attracting better and better things. The first principle is simply to, at the end of your week, review your progress. And you want to do this short-term and long-term because you want to compare yourself against your former self. So one example you can do, and this is something that I've been doing lately, is reviewing my progress over the last 5 or 10 years. So you can look at your past and your progress in that past from different time sequences. As an example, just look at where you were 5 years ago. Think about where you were in around January of 2018. And then without any emotion, positive or negative, basically just write down the specifics of what actually happened. Write down your biggest forms of progress, milestones in your work, maybe in your income, but also any forms of life experience you've had that have been important and meaningful. could be having gone on certain vacations, seen certain things. Maybe you had children. Maybe you read certain books. Maybe you had certain experiences that really expanded you. And so one thing to do is just reflect on a long-term form of progress, 5, 10 years, and just write down the highlights, the bullets. And then one thing you could do, if you were honest, all progress starts by telling the truth, is look at it, reflect on it, and be honest about it and say, if I was much more bold, if I had a bigger vision, if I had more commitment, and if I was less willing to fail, is it possible that I could achieve as much in the next 12 months as I did in all of the last 5 or 10 years combined? Maybe you couldn't actually do as many things in the next year as you did in the last 5 or 10 in terms of volume of activity, but maybe because of your knowledge, your insights, your ability to think, the betterment of the people around you, the betterment of your thinking, the amount of leverage you have, maybe in terms of finances or any other forms of leverage, maybe with less effort, but better thinking, better thoughtfulness, you could certainly achieve more, expand more, progress more, learn more in the next year as you did in the last 5 or 10. And so you use your past as a baseline for future growth. And so you could do this in the long term. If you're operating in qualitative time, and if you're operating as your future self, and if you're learning from your experience, and if you're being really honest about your experiences, then you can look back on your past, call it 5 or 10 years, write down what's achieved, and then ask yourself, what would be required of me if I was to expand my vision and operate with much more commitment, clarity, and approach-oriented action, and to weed out that 80%? Because a lot of your last 5 or 10 years were spent in the 80%. The 80% are things which are busy, but not ultimately effective. Also, we all waste so much time. We all waste so much time on the internet or other forms of distraction. And if you were to weed out that 80%, and if you were to just focus on the 20% which matters most to you and to your 10x future self, what would be possible if you were way more committed, way more courageous, and if you used your days and weeks much better? Also, if you slept much better, and I'll get into morning and evening routines in a second. Basically, you want to have honest self-evaluation. This means you're not hypercritical of your past. There's no reason to be mad at your past self. Your past self, even a year ago or even 6 months ago, is not the same person you are today. You've learned a lot, you've grown a lot, you've changed a lot. The world's different. So you're not the same person as your past self. And having any forms of shame, regret, or anger towards your past isn't going to help your future. Instead, you want to be very honest about your past, honest about your past self's ignorance. Also, your current self is very ignorant compared to your future self. But one of my favorite quotes is actually, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. One thing you can be honest about is that your past self wasn't quite as ready as your current self to take certain action, to take certain risks, to be as committed as you are to what you want. Your past self just simply wasn't ready. They were ready for what they were ready for, and they lived the way they lived, and that got you to where you're at. And so you can be open and honest about that. But now, if you're more ready to commit as your future self, to commit to certain dreams, goals, ambitions, and standards, once you are ready and you can be committed, then you start to see it. Selectively attention is basically what psychologists call selective attention. You see what you're looking for, you see what you're ready to see, you see what you're committed to. And so once you're ready, then when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. You become more aware and honest, and you have less ego about your past. You also are way more open and honest about what needs to happen and changes that need to be made so that you can actually go and be and do and have what you want. Another key aspect, though, of reviewing progress, and this is also long and short term, is just genuinely appreciating your progress. One of the things that I learned from Dan Sullivan, and we actually wrote an entire book on the subject called The Gap and the Gain, is just, it's very beautiful to appreciate your gains, appreciate your progress, and to quantify them, to actually evaluate. This morning, and I'm filming this video on January 9th of 2023, I just reviewed the progress of what happened so far in January, and I literally just wrote it down. And when you quantify your past, it actually becomes more easy to have a quantifiable, visual, vivid future self. Yes, your future self will be qualitatively different, meaning you will be fundamentally, you will be a different person in the future. But it is good and powerful to have a quantitative, measurable, specific, vivid future self. And the more specific you can get, obviously, the more you can then create a plan and pathway and a strategy to getting there. One other thing about measuring your progress backwards is that you're no longer comparing yourself to other people. You're only comparing yourself to your past self. This enables you to have a way more intrinsic motivation, and it allows you to play your own game where you're just outgrowing your past self. You're enjoying your progress, you're enjoying your gains, but also you're creating specific gains for your future that have nothing to do with the standards or ideals of the outside world. Most people's goals are trained by the outside world, whether that's their culture, their peer group, their parents, And so they're just striving for things that social media has told them to strive for. And we do live in a world where social media is literally designed to reshape our worldview and to reshape our goals, ambitions, and desires. So you've got to be really careful about the inputs you consume, because every form of input has an agenda. And that agenda may be to alter your views such that you're afraid of the future, so that you have a herd mentality, so that you do X, Y, and Z. And so as you be very cautious and weary about the inputs that are shaping your worldview, and as you block out the inputs that ultimately are training you to think like everyone else. So this would be mainstream media, news, social media. As you block all those things out, and as you measure your own progress, as you review your own experiences, and as you value your own experiences, and as you quantify your own experiences, and as you learn from your own experiences, and you start only measuring yourself against your past self, you're only just progressing further and further, and you get to decide where you want to go. You get to decide your future. You get to decide your future self, but also you get to decide what you value and what you'll strive for. This also allows you to just view time qualitatively and quantitatively, and you get to actually set up better and better weeks. And so measure your progress in long-term scopes, but also short-term. As I just said, I reviewed my progress of 2022 recently, but I also just reviewed my progress of the last 7 or 8, 9 days. And now I'm looking at this week ahead of me. And this is part of having a weekly planning session. It's just give yourself some space. It could be 20 or 30 minutes, but give yourself the space without pings and dings to genuinely and honestly review your week, be honest, review your progress, appreciate your progress, but also be honest and evaluate what went well and what didn't. And then when you start to plan and map out your next week, think in terms of seemingly impossible goals. No one can achieve the impossible without striving for it. And we're all always outdoing our past self. You have done things that your former self thought were impossible. And humanity has certainly done things that we once thought were impossible. Flying to the moon, flying an airplane, building a computer, watching this video. So if you're not striving for something way above and beyond anything you've currently done, then you basically have a fixed mindset. And you're just kind of going through the motions. You always want to be stretching and striving towards something beyond what actually you even know you can do. You want to stretch beyond your current level of confidence and skills. You want to stretch beyond what you've tried before and have soul stretching experiences. Those are peak experiences. And so when you're thinking about the next week, and it's not in terms of volume, although that may be something you do, it's in terms of progress, in terms of genuine experience. And so when you're mapping your next 7 days, think, what would be the most powerful, transformational, profound week in the next 7 days, that by the end of next week, and then your next week's future self, 7 days from now, becomes basically a milestone. And you're just living milestone to milestone, where you're actively living in flow. And I'm going to share more on flow in a second, but you're going for depth, not necessarily for quantity. You're going for depth of quality, not quantity, and just true progress, not effort, not busyness. So every week, again, should look different from the last, and you should set seemingly impossible visions for each week and stretch towards those. And here's the beautiful part. When you're living from a gain mindset, and also when you're just operating from comparing to your past self, then you don't beat yourself up for not hitting your goals. You don't beat yourself up. Instead, you actually just honestly evaluate your progress as you did the week before. You reflect on your progress. You appreciate your progress. You acknowledge that you're further than you were last week. You acknowledge that you're further than your past self. You acknowledge that you know more because of what you strive for. Maybe you had some big failures. Maybe you had some big successes. You now know more than your past self did 7 days ago. And then you just honestly evaluate. You appreciate your progress. You don't beat yourself up. There's no boogeyman getting mad at you because you didn't achieve some goal. Now you can just learn from your experience, and then you can set the next vision. And goals and essentially standards are there to give you a framework for focus. Actually, that's one of the key aspects of flow is that without having clear goals, it's hard to know where to focus. Clear goals are a key aspect of flow. And I'll get into flow more in a second, because I want to teach you how to build your life more around flow, because flow is a qualitative experience of time. Flow means you're going deeper and deeper in the value of that time, and the opportunity and the potential of time in deep flow is very different from time where you're just scattered and at the surface. You want to go deep, deep, deep. There's a great book on the subject actually called Catching the Big Fish. I forget who, but the book is called Catching the Big Fish. And it's all about consciousness, creativity, and self-expansion and meditation. It's all about going deeper and deeper and deeper like you would in the ocean. But if you're always skipping from surface to surface to surface and not much flow, you're just at the surface. That's your level of consciousness. That's also your level of vision and your level of potential. The deeper and deeper you go, the more you can have subconscious shifts, changes, and also the more depth you can have in your transformations. And by the way, peak experiences and flow are essentially the same thing. The deeper you go into flow, whether you're deeply focusing on something and creating something, you're going to have a peak experience. But also flow could be in terms of fun, novelty, recovery. But also flow is in large part courage, trying something and having feedback and risk that really puts you into a flow state. so that you're always expanding. So let's go to the next one. As you're doing your weekly review session, you do want to continuously expand your vision of what's possible. You want to think 10x bigger. And 10x doesn't have to be literally a bigger zero, but just if you were thinking bigger, and if you were thinking bigger and better, what would be possible? I love the quote, nothing is impossible with God. And so what could be possible in the next 7 days? And the only reason this is great, when you're thinking bigger and when you're giving yourself the space to meditate and vision, journal and just think bigger and think with more possibility thinking. Actually, one of the things that I learned in my undergrad in psychology is that agency as human beings is basically the belief in possibility, that something more is possible for you, or that you could do something differently, that you're not just stuck on a track, or that you're not just stuck as you are, but you have possibility. Things could be different. Things could be very different this week. And so if you think in terms of possibility, and if you expand your vision and you're not limiting yourself, but if you're thinking much bigger, and you're open to the idea that actually this week really interesting big things could happen, and then you're going on walks, you're meditating, you're journaling, you're giving yourself space to think. This is one of the key things, is giving yourself space to think. Most people don't do that. Instead, when they have 5 minutes, they just immediately plug themselves into low-level media. It's low-level distractions. So give yourself space to meditate, to think, to journal, to reflect, and to visualize. And as you do that, you're going to get some really profound ideas. And those ideas then could be acted upon. And so that's the idea that vision and pondering sparks inspiration and innovation. Even just this morning, I was walking around my neighborhood for about 40 minutes. I walked about 2.5 miles, and I was listening to various books, even listening to the New Testament, but I was listening to scriptures. I was also listening to business books. And just by sitting there and having the walk and having the space to think and meditate and journal, I got an insane thought. Because I've been thinking about my future self. I've been committing to my future self. I've been taking action. And as you take action, your actions and your goals are basically the strongest indicator of your identity. And as you're getting committed to bigger goals, and as you're thinking more about your future self, but also as you're taking proactive action, it's a really amazing flywheel or feedback loop where you just get more and more inspiration. And this is, again, why morning and evening routines are crucial for you to transform your subconscious, to upgrade your identity, and to keep getting better and better action towards your future self, to actually take better and better, to change your behavior in a more proactive way. But I got a really profound idea this morning, and it's a stacking on, and it's basically a stack to the ideas and insights I had last week. But because I gave myself space and I was giving myself good inputs, and because I gave myself space to sit and journal and reflect, I got an idea that might change my life. And it's an additive to the ideas I was getting last week. It was inspiration. And then I went and immediately acted upon it. And a lot of the times the inspiration will be something you can do, but it's also often someone you could reach out to. And so I then reached out to this person, sent them a private message, and it was a very powerful, bold message that we'll see. Again, I'm not attached to any outcome, but I'm operating as my future self. I'm getting nonlinear insights and ideas. I'm giving myself the space to learn. And then I'm immediately acting upon the profound ideas that I've given myself the space for. So you want to have the right mindset, and also you want to be in the right environments, the right setting, set and setting. And the set and setting is about being in a right mindset and openness to ideas, openness to inspiration. And that could include better inputs, better conversations with better people, but also just being in a quiet place where you can actually just listen, think, ponder, reflect. And then the right setting would be putting yourself in environments where you can just think, learn, whether that's being out in nature walking, whether that's being in a quiet place where you can journal, reflect, read a good book. Put yourself in the right set and setting so that inspiration can hit. And as you're visualizing your future self, your subconscious and or God both will give you profound ideas that will then be your pathways to ultimately moving towards your goals. Next would be operating in flow. There are 2 core forms of flow. And then there's many segments within that, but one would be deep focus flow. This is where you're focused on a singular task and you're going deeper and deeper on that. And most people's work days and most people's lives, given technology, are not very designed for focus flow. They don't go very, very deep into one thing. Most people, if you look at your to-do list, for example, today, you probably have 10 or 20 or 30 things on your to-do list. And so you've already planned for non-flow. You've already planned for jumping from surface to surface to surface. And chances are, from an 80-20 perspective, almost all of the activities on your to-do list today would be the 80% of activities that are producing very few of your results. This is busy, but not productive. And so instead, you want to design for focus flow and also recovery flow. And both of these are active. It's not like recovery flow is just you sitting on the couch and doing nothing. It's active recovery. This could be going to the gym, going for a walk, doing new things with loved ones and friends, playing games, novelty, but also new experiences. Your recovery wants to be at least as high quality as your focus. And research in occupational and organizational psychology shows that it's called psychological detachment from work. It's the ability to turn fully off and to psychologically turn off work mode and to engage fully and actively in other areas of your life. Actually, you're going to start to get a lot of insight, ideas, and your ability to fully detach from work is in direct proportion to your full ability to fully attach. And both of these forms of flow are very important: active recovery and also active focus. And so when you're thinking about your week, you're obviously going to want to build it around less but better, higher quality, less quantity. You're going to want to weed out 80% of the things that don't matter. And you're going to want to go very, very deep in a few things in terms of quality and true progress. And so you'd want to start to design your days very differently. So rather than trying to do 5 or 10 things, you're only really thinking about doing 1, 2, or 3 things very well. There's a great quote from Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great. He said, if you have more than 3 priorities, you have 0. So you really shouldn't strive for more than 2 or 3 things on a day. And instead you think in terms of depth. You could also batch things together. So like if you're, for example, if you're a writer, all of your writing goes on that one day and you're just going deep, really deep on like one activity. And so maybe you're just going for depth and true progress and true growth. So focus flow is really 2 things. One is going really deep into one thing, and that's where you're catching the big fish. Back to the book, Catching the Big Fish. You're going very, very deep rather than shallow, skipping along the layers. And as you go deeper and deeper into flow, you'll learn more, your brain will change more, and your vision will expand more. You also just do higher quality work. And there's a great book on the subject called Deep Work by Cal Newport. And it's about how we live in a time where all of the tools are available to us. We have so much access to beautiful information and so many tools to expand and spread and scale businesses or ideas. And the real key here is to go deep into creativity, to actually do deep work. And if you can do really deep work, you can make new connections, you can create innovations, you can create things of really insane quality, which then can scale really big in today's environment. The problem is that the very tools that allow quality to scale are the same tools that distract us so much that we can't focus. He said in that book that focus is basically the IQ of the 21st century. I'd say that that's part of the equation. Obviously, you want to have a bigger vision. You want to have a lot of hope towards the future, but focus is a big aspect of that. And so that's one part of focus flow. But another aspect of focus flow is not so much about going deep into, call it deep work, creativity, whether that's thinking, strategizing, learning, or creating. But another aspect of focus flow is about making power moves. It's about actually making courage moves towards your future self. It's about going for no. It's about willingly trying and getting rejected and pitching yourself, attempting things, actually going for, like, putting yourself out there in big ways. I love the concept from Tim Ferriss where he said that your success in life usually can come down to the number of awkward conversations you're willing to have. So if you're willing to be courageous, put yourself out there, put yourself in a position where you might get rejected, put yourself in a position where you have to get feedback, where there's emotional, psychological risk. That's a big part of courage. Then obviously you're going to have really big peak experiences and you're going to open yourself up to big opportunities because, again, 80% of people or more are operating based on fear and avoidance. And so if you're going to be more approach oriented, where you're not afraid of failing, you're willing to learn from your experiences and go for no, then not only are you going for depth in focus and really like learning and transformation, but you're also going for height in terms of aspiration, stretching, striving, being willing to get rejected and not being attached to the outcome. So that's focus flow. But recovery flow is similar. Obviously, recovery flow is about expansion. It's about novelty, newness, connection with loved ones, enjoyment, having fun, and also sleep, setting yourself up for sleep. So the key here is that the more deep you go into flow and the more flow you have, the more flow you'll get. How you do anything is how you do everything. And so if you start designing and building your weeks and your days around flow, both focus flow and recovery flow, you're going to sleep better. You're going to have way more inspiration. You're going to be more approach oriented, where you're designing your life how you want to, rather than having your life designed for you. You're also going to have a growth mindset where you're stretching and striving for things, you're learning, and you're willing to embrace failures, massive feedback, and then translate that into deep learning. And obviously, you're going to want to optimize around sleep, better and better sleep, because sleep is where your body learns, your brain heals, grows, learns, builds memories. And so that form of recovery, you got to be active about. You got to be active about and disciplined. I love what Ryan Holiday said. You got to be disciplined about sleep. So you have to be disciplined enough to ultimately put your phone on airplane mode and design an evening routine for sleep. This is back to thinking 10x bigger and also reviewing your progress, which is focus on progress, not effort. One of the things I learned about time relativity is that, and this is according to Einstein's theory of relativity, is that time and space fluctuate based on perspective, based on the user, based on the person. And so the faster an object moves through space relative to something else, the slower time goes. And so as an example, let's just say 2 people have the same goal. and let's just say that goal is to make $1 million. If one person can achieve that goal in a week and another person can achieve that goal in a decade, then the one person's time is that much slower, like hundreds of times slower, because they traveled the same distance in a week, whereas it took that person a decade. And so that's just kind of a basically an interesting way of looking at it. But in terms of like planets, and if you've ever seen the movie Interstellar, they really show time relativity. And this is on a really big scale, but basically when planets are moving through space much faster than other planets, the time is literally slower on those planets relative to the slower planet. And so, and again, you're only playing against your past self. But if you focus on progress, not on busyness, if you think like, how can I make the same distance in a week that my past self did on the same goal or in a similar way in a year, then if you could learn to make that much progress in a shorter amount of time, then that time was slower. It was literally slower. It was qualitatively slower, and you'll have a lot more peak experiences. And this is how you slow time down. So you don't focus on time in terms of minutes. You focus on time in terms of progress and in terms of distance traveled. And that's really how time is looked at from a physics standpoint. Even if you look at the Earth is said to be 8 light minutes away. And so it's the distance that light travels between the Earth and the sun, and that distance is 8 light minutes. And so time is really about distance traveled. And so if you can travel the same distance in a week as your past self could in a year or in a decade, then your time is that much slower. And you can begin to slow your time by focusing on progress, not on busyness. If you can think, how can I progress more? What would be required to make this much progress in a week as maybe my past self made in a month? Then this is again where your time gets more qualitative and more relative and more nonlinear. And this is where you can start really slowing your time down. Also, when you focus on progress, you're operating from your future. You're not operating from your present or past. You're thinking in terms of where you want to be, your future self, and then you're letting the future dictate what you do, not the past or the present. Most people are past present oriented. And this is something that Dr. Joe Dispenza talks a lot about, and also something that Dr. Gay Hendricks talks about. Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about this a lot in his book, Becoming Supernatural. Dr. Gay Hendricks talks a lot about this in The Big Leap. But in terms of Dr. Joe Dispenza, he says we're either past present oriented or we're future present oriented. And when you're future present oriented, you're letting the future dictate what you do in the present. Whereas when you're past present oriented, you're letting the past dictate who you are and what you do in the present. And when you're past present oriented, you very much use the past as an excuse. You are the way you are because of your past, and you're determined by your past, and your past is driving the ship, and your past is determining what you're comfortable with and what you're willing to do, and it's dictating your identity. Whereas if you're focused non-linearly on what's possible, you begin to utilize the future and what you want for your future to shape who you are and what you're being and what you're doing now. And that's a much more profound, powerful, intentional, conscious, and active and approach-oriented way. And when you let the future dictate what you do, then your present is going to look very different from the past because the future is continuously expanding and evolving. And so if the future is driving you, your week is going to look very different from last week. And as you do the review process where you're being honest about your week, about your month, and you are honest that you now know things very differently than your past self. Because you now know different, because you're honestly evaluating and you've learned a lot from your last week, and you stretched a lot, you had a lot of courage moves, a lot of flow. So you've really transformed a lot. You had a lot of deep peak experiences. You grew more that, last week than many people do in a year or more each week. It's like you're living, it's like you're living years and decades while most people are living days and weeks. You're really transforming, you're growing, you're expanding that much because you're stretching, you're having courage, you're being thoughtful, you're going deep into flow. You're really learning a lot, and then you're genuinely being honest and evaluating your progress. One other really key concept here when you're focusing on progress, not effort, is that you think in terms of who, not how. Actually, this is another book that Dan Sullivan and I wrote. We wrote the book called Who, Not How. But it's often relationships that have the most leverage. If you're thinking in terms of a 10x bigger future self, rather than you doing all the work yourself and thinking in terms of effort, you think in terms of results and in terms of progress. And that will lead you to interesting relationships with people who can open up massive doors, or that through masterminding or through collaborating, the whole becomes different from the sum of the parts. And so as you're thinking bigger, people will come to mind. And those people are people that you want to synergize with and collaborate with and develop relationships with. And you want to approach those relationships as a giver, not a taker. Using Adam Grant's language, Dr. Adam Grant, is you want to be a giver. You want to think in terms of what's in it for them, using Joe Polish's language, what's in it for them, and making a compelling offer. I love the quote that it's better to make a compelling offer than a convincing argument. And so when you're thinking much bigger, and then all of a sudden people come to mind who you could team with, hire, or work with, you want obviously the vision to be collaborative, and you want to think in terms of being a giver and what's in it for them, and how could this be 10x for them as well. And if you operate from that mindset, and this also just resonates with the book How to Win Friends and Influence People, that you think in terms of other people, not so much about yourself, then you can create opportunities. Even Zig Ziglar said you can get anything you want in life by helping the right people get what they want in life. And so if that's your vision, and it's seemingly impossible, but you know that there are people out there who could help you get there, and who have probably already been there, and who have the right pieces in place. And if you could help them in certain ways, or team with them in certain ways, and you can help them achieve their goals, then anything becomes possible. So if you start thinking in terms of who, not how, then many things become possible to you in a single week. All right, let's talk about utilizing evening and morning routines. Every night you can go to bed, and if you have been disciplined about your sleep, if you've put your phone on airplane mode, if you've stopped just mindlessly consuming trash, which most people do, over 90%, and this research shows this, over 90% of people procrastinate sleep by just reactively scrolling, and they're just putting trash media into their mind, and then they go to sleep, and that's what their subconscious recreates over and over again. Whatever you do the hour before sleep deeply impacts your identity and your subconscious, and what your subconscious can do for you. And that deeply impacts who you're going to be the next day. That's why if you're reactive at night and just scrolling, then you're going to wake up and you're going to be reactive in the morning, and you're going to be on the hamster wheel, and other people's lives and agendas, and basically your current life and your current commitments are going to dictate what you do. Whereas if you're proactive, visual, thoughtful, and intentional, and conscious about your evening routine, and if you're visualizing your future self, if you're praying, meditating, and thinking about not only your big picture future self, but also near term, like who you want to be and what you could do tomorrow, and you're strategizing on that, and you pray about it, there's the great quote from Thomas Edison: never go to bed without a request to your subconscious. And so if you're visualizing, thinking about it, and planning for it, and then you're committing to important but not urgent things the next day, then you wake up and you then get yourself into the right set and setting. You get yourself into your journal and you output. This is something that I learned from Josh Waitzkin, who wrote the book, The Art of Learning, is you want to get the creative subconscious breakthroughs that your brain has been producing and your subconscious has been producing while you've been asleep. And you do that by journaling in the morning and writing things down. And you could go on a walk, you could listen to meditation music or whatnot, but this is how you put yourself in a position to spark those insights and those revelations and those inspiration, which then you can act upon. And so your evening and morning routine are crucial about just going to bed, visualizing your future self, making commitments about who you'll be the next day, visualizing yourself not only in the outcome, but in the process, and making commitments about you doing powerful, bold things, and then waking up and getting straight to it, getting straight to the important, not getting caught up in the urgent, meditating, visualizing, gratitude, and then actively doing the most important thing. Some people call it eating the frog, which is doing the worst first, or doing the most important thing before the others, actually prioritizing how you spend your time and weeding out more and more of the 80%, and you owning your time, you owning your day, and you living your days increasingly how you want them and how you've designed them. And when you make a commitment the night before, you wake up and you follow through on that commitment. So that's how you transform and have amazing days. All right, the next one is about set and report progress to the right people. So there's a concept called Pearsons Law, and Pearsons Law states that when progress is measured, progress improves. And when progress is measured and reported back in terms of having accountability, then progress expands exponentially. So this is one of the key reasons why you would want like a weekly planning session, and also a daily planning session, where you can literally measure your progress in key metrics, like measure your progress that day, measure how you learned, what you did. If you're not measuring your progress, then you're not actually aware. You can't manage what you don't measure. That's something I think Peter Drucker said. And so if you're not measuring something, if you're not tracking it, if you're not evaluating it, then you're not learning. And if you're not tracking and measuring, then you're not aware. It's similar to like your diet, your finances. If you're not tracking and if you're not measuring what you're doing, then you're essentially in chaos mode. And so Pearsons Law, again, just states that whatever you measure improves, and whatever you measure and report back improves exponentially. And so it's key as you're setting massive, important, seemingly impossible targets for each week to actually report those to someone. For me, I report them primarily to my assistant. My assistant is who I go back and forth with, and I set those targets. And then each day I'm setting 1, 2, or 3 major milestones. And then at the end of the week, I evaluate, I measure, and I report my progress. And then I set new goals. And again, whether I hit them or not really doesn't matter. The fact is, it's about who I'm being more so than about what I'm doing. Whoever you're being, and if you're being towards your future self, then you'll be doing it at a different level, and you'll be making massive, really exciting progress. And so the key here is just take the time to measure your progress and report it to someone. And then as you're measuring and reporting your progress, set better goals, and then stretch towards those goals. And just every week, this is why you got to do this every week, is just measure your progress, be honest, a self-analysis, self-reflection, appreciate your gains. This is the principle number 1. And then based on what you now know, based on what you've learned, based on what you made possible through your peak experiences, through your flow, through your courage moves, through your recovery, through your learning, through your self-analysis, set bigger and more exciting or more better, more useful goals for the next 7 days. And every 7 days is going to look different. Maybe what's really important right now is that you actually take 3 or 4 days off fully and just fully focus on your wife and your kids or something. Again, every week is going to look qualitatively different if you're being more conscious and thoughtful about your future self. So what you want to do, and this is a really beautiful aspect of visualizing your future self, and it's also a beautiful aspect of high performance and flow, is that you want to have milestones. And each week you can have a milestone that you're sprinting towards, and then you stop and you have a massive form of recovery, you evaluate, and then you set up the next milestone, the next sprint. And each week can be a new milestone that you're sprinting towards and you're having big peak experiences towards. You're in more of the Kairos time and you're having big recovery and big evaluation. So if you're sprinting each week, and the sprint doesn't necessarily have to be that you're exhausting yourself. It's just that you're being really conscious and thoughtful and wise. And you're really sprinting in terms of your consciousness, your expansion. Maybe you're being more adept and deep about your relationship with your kids, and maybe you're being really intentional and thoughtful about how you can have a deeper connection and peak experiences with maybe your daughter than you've had in the last year, and you can operate differently from your future. So you're setting bigger and better experiences. And one of my favorite quotes is the idea that the most extraordinary people are the ones who have the most extraordinary experiences. And that goes back to the Jean Rousseau quote that the person who has lived the most is not the one who's had the most years, but the one who's had the most powerful transformational experiences. And so each week you can be designing for transformational experiences. Each month you can be designing in really powerful, exciting experiences. And once you get committed, then you will find the way. It's about committing. So for example, buying the plane ticket, buying the tickets to the show and taking your daughter to that date, or whatever it is, like designing in peak experiences, designing in flow experiences, designing in transformation, and raising your new norm on what is just normal for how you live. This is the final one. And it's just about start over again. Do this every week, like each week, and you're playing your own game. Review your progress each week, be honest and evaluate your progress, and set seemingly impossible visions that are based on progress, not busyness, that are based on your future self and what you want and what would be exciting to you and what you value, and live in qualitative and relative and Kairos time, which is where you're slowing time down and you're living beautifully each week. And each week's going to look different because you're different week by week. As you're stretching, you're growing, you're going deep in flow, you're learning, you're giving yourself space for analysis. And as you're having beautiful recovery and peak experiences with loved ones, and as you're being increasingly honest with yourself and weeding out more and more of the 80% that was your past self, and as you're operating more and more from a future present orientation, each week is going to be really profound. And you're going to learn so much each week, especially if you weed out a lot of the things like mainstream media, news, social media, like the stuff that's just ultimately a waste of time and distraction. As you raise the floor on just your normal experience in your life, but also on your vision and what you're willing to do. And if you become more approach oriented, then if you take the time each week, review your progress, short-term and long-term, and make better and better plans, and go for transformation, experience, and what's possible each week. And then you evaluate and you just do this again and again. Your weeks become phenomenal. Your weeks become profound, and they also become unpredictable. You cannot actually predict what is going to happen next week, even though you can make plans and you can strive for it. You can't predict, because while you're walking, learning, thinking, you're going to hit so many forms of inspiration and ideas and revelation that those will take you in nonlinear directions, because it's your future self that's giving you the ideas, not your past. And so you will be surprised by how non-predictable each week gets, even though you get better and better at consciously planning and creating those weeks. I hope this helps. My name is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. Please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. Please share it. Down below, you can get free Kindle books to Be Your Future Self Now and The Gap in the Gain. And you can also download my peak state checklist. Have an amazing day. I hope you enjoyed this. Talk to you later.